Producer, and Anita Brockington, our engineer. Recently, I began path walking in the woods and then decided to go to the bookstore to look for stories about people who have made a serious commitment to perhaps the more arduous network trails in America. I learned from one book I read that paths are for walking in and about, but trails suggest climbing from a lower to higher elevation. Ben Montgomery, a staff writer at the Tampa Bay Times and co-founder of Auburn how do I say this? Chautauqua? Is that the right way to say that?
Aqua.
Okay, well, we'll correct that. Is a Southern Writers Collective that he founded as well, co-founded, as well as being a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2010. He joins us this portion of our program to share his delightful and inspiring and awesome book, Grandma Gatewood's Walk, the inspiring story of the woman who saved the Appalachian Trail, a Chicago Press Review 2016. In his book, Montgomery described Grandma Gatewood from a news article telling her story back then, for she began her hike on May of 1955, quote, at 67 years old, weighing 150 pounds, standing 5'2", Emma Gatewood began her one-woman trek of the Appalachian Trail beginning in Georgia. Here to tell this amazing story, as well as his own odyssey following her effort decades later, is New York Times bestseller, Ben Montgomery. What a beautiful book you've written.
Thank you so much. That's so kind of you. I'm glad to hear you liked it.
Oh, well, I read it in 2 sittings. I was so enthralled with it. I love adventure books, firstly, but I have found that people like yourself who are columnists and writers in general have a beautiful way of telling story because you pay so much attention to detail. So that's what I'd like to start with is A, why did you pick this as a book to write? And then B, how did you go about beginning to source out what you needed to find out?
Fine questions both. I wrote a story for the newspaper in 2011 about an unsolved lynching in North Florida that had happened in 1934, but nobody had ever been held accountable, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 people participated. And the story got a lot of attention nationally and sort of made the rounds on social media and elsewhere, and somehow wound up in the hands of a literary agent in New York, Jane Distel, who called me up out of the blue one day, and this is every writer's dream, called me up and said, I love your style, and I wonder if you have any book ideas. And so I went casting about for ideas and fell very quickly on a story that my mother told me growing up about a distant relative of ours. It was my mother's great aunt, a woman named Emma Gatewood, who had been the first woman to solo through hike, as we say, the Appalachian Trail. And I didn't know much more about her than that. I knew she had some interesting tales. She scared off a black bear somewhere in the Northwest with her umbrella, things like that. But I knew just the bare bones of her trip. And I went online and searched for some serious biographical work on her life and found nothing. And so I thought, here is my opportunity, not only to tell a story about an interesting woman, but to sort of help solidify her legacy in American letters.
Yeah, what a beautiful sequence of events. So, it's fascinating when you try to write about people who are deceased, and often from time periods where everybody who knew them are deceased as well. So how did you actually do the research you did?
Well, she died in 1973, and I was born in 1978, so we missed each other by 5 years. But thank goodness 4 of her 11 children were still alive when I started reporting the story back in 2011, 2012. My very first phone call was to Lucy Gatewood Seeds, who actually just turned 91 years old.
Wow.
About a week ago. And Lucy was the youngest daughter of Emma Gatewood. She lived just totally good luck here. She lived in Orlando, Florida. My home is in Tampa, Florida. And we have some family connection. I think we're cousins somehow. But I called her up and I introduced myself and I told her that I was interested in doing a book about her mother. And she said, well, why don't you come to Jacksonville and meet me? And so got in the car and drove up, and it took a little bit of trust building. I had to
Yeah.
kind of prove to her she was very proprietary of her mother's story. She'd been the keeper of the flame for a long while and kind of representing her mother's legacy. And so I had to convince her that I was serious about this as a project and that I wasn't just some Johnny come lately, and that this was a book I was going to do and do right and do justice to. And so once we had established a bit of a relationship, Lucy not only gave me many, many hours of her time, but gave me access to kind of an archive of her mother's life that she had been keeping around for years. And it was, banker's boxes in a guest closet, a guest room closet, but the boxes contained her mother's scrapbooks and journals that she had kept as she walked the Appalachian Trail, correspondence, photos, all this treasure trove of wonderful information that helped tell the story of her mother's life. And beyond that, Emma was quite famous in her day. She had met many, many dozens of newspaper reporters, television and radio reporters who wrote about her, and to include, Sports Illustrated magazine, which was just a year old in 1955, the year that Emma hiked the Appalachian Trail. And Sports Illustrated did a wonderful short profile of Emma Gatewood in 1955. So I had not only interviews with her 4 children, but that source material that she had left behind in her own hand. And then beyond that, newspaper and magazine stories, by the dozen that had been written about her while she was still alive.
Well, you did a beautiful job putting it together and in such a way that I'm sure the story reflects so much of her own feelings while she hiked this trail. I mean, I have not done this myself. I do actually know of somebody who met her husband on the Appalachian Trail, and they married at the end of it.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, really interesting. Anyway, not tonight, but another time. And
There are lots of love stories that start on the Appalachian Trail, I can promise you.
it's so interesting to me. And so describe for us, as you do for your readers in Grandma Gatewood's Walk, the inspiring story of the woman who saved the Appalachian Trail, what the trail was like. And because I remember you saying something about she saw an ad that it was like a pleasant thing to do, and she just
Sure.
thought, oh, on a quirk, well, maybe I'll go do that. What was it like at the time she made this decision? Oh, yeah, I'm going to go do this.
Yeah, well, the trail was relatively young. It was the brainchild of a man named Myron Avery, who thought it might be useful for the population that lived along the eastern seaboard to have access to a path in the wilderness that basically, ran from the north to the south or the south to the north. And was protected and was a place to sort of get away from it all. This was, dreamed up before the interstate highway system came along, and so the
Right.
timing of the thing was quite perfect. But Avery and a few others began planning this route, and of course, it took cooperation and help from a number of different states and organizations and states and hikers clubs and Boy Scout troops and things like that. But eventually, in the late 30s, the trail finally was stitched together, and it ran about 2,050 miles at the time from Mount Oglethorpe in northern Georgia all the way to Mount Katahdin in Maine, near Millinocket, Maine. And it was maintained by volunteers. There was no governmental entity that took care of the trail. So the trail was it was maintained by the volunteer effort from many, many people up and down the trail. But it was for a long time very lightly known. Not many Americans knew it existed. The planners of the original trail never imagined anybody would try to walk the whole thing in one fell swoop. And so the first man who did it, Earl Shafer, in 1948, when he completed an entire walk of the trail, he sent word to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy that he had done so, and they doubted his story. They asked him to come in and prove that he had, in fact, walked the whole thing. So he had to show up and show them his trail journals and show his photographs that he had taken along the way before they finally were convinced that somebody had actually done it. So he kind of broke the mold in 48. And then, just about every year after that, at least one person would hike the trail. So by the time Emma Gatewood gets the urge to do it in 1954, which was her first attempt, only a handful of men had hiked the whole thing. And so as you mentioned, she had read about the trail in National Geographic magazine, and it was in a story that was driven by these beautiful color photographs, and it painted a very roseate picture of what it took to hike the AT. It said anyone in moderate physical condition could hayfoot, strawfoot from Georgia to Maine without much problem. It said the trail was as wide as a Mack truck, that it was well blazed, the entire route. It was virtually impossible to get lost. The story said there were places to eat along the way. There were shelters in which one could sleep along the way. And Emma found very little of that to be true. She ran into all sorts of trouble when she got started.
Well, people sometimes have in their mind an image of a trail, just like that description from National Geographic you just shared. But when you read your book and understand the arduous trek and climbing, and the thing that is so extraordinary beyond just the physical stamina she had, even though she said she loved to walk and that her legs just got moving and they kind of carried her on, is the way in which she went. I mean, she wore Keds tennis shoes. I mean, you compare it to today's hikers. Do that for us. Show us how
Sure.
Emma went versus how people go today.
Well, your timing is perfect because I'm preparing for a 3-week hike with my children who are 15, 13, and 10.
Wow.
And we're going to do 161 miles through Virginia, which is a pretty slack, easy, comfortable stretch of trail. And we all have the very best backpacks money could buy. And
Yeah.
I'm not exaggerating when I say I spent $150 on my own backpack just to get the best lightweight material and that sort of thing. These are comfortable packs. I have an $800 sleeping bag.
Yeah.
You can spend no small amount of money on trail gear. And
Well, when you read the list, I have to tell you, I've gone online sometimes to read the list of what people are supposed to take when they go on these excursions, and I'm thinking, well, there's 50 pounds. That's half my body weight.
Oh yeah, I have a stove that I can fit in the palm of my hand, that you affix to the top of a butane bottle.
Oh, yeah,
And so things have changed a lot. What Emma took was a denim drawstring sack that she had sewn herself back home in Gallia County, Ohio, and she filled it with the things that she thought she might need, to include an army blanket. She had no tent, no sleeping bag, no maps. She had a shower curtain to keep the rain off. She had a tin that had some Band-Aids in it and some Vicks salve and some bobby pins. She carried raisins and powdered milk occasionally, and some peanuts and some bouillon cubes to suck on for the sodium. And hilariously, a gingham dress that she could shake out in the event she had to walk through town, because she always wanted to look proper, and on the trail she wore men's dungarees and a button-up flannel shirt. So, and like you said, she hiked most of the time in Keds sneakers. She felt like canvas shoes were more comfortable. She had pretty terrible bunions, and the canvas shoes allowed for some flexibility in her foot. So,
by the way, that's so funny, because I have found the most comfortable shoes for my walking in the woods are my high top Converse.
Very
For the
nice.
same reason, because you can feel what's under your foot, and yet you still have support for your ankle.
I think you would find in Emma a kindred spirit, because occasionally she's photographed wearing Chuck Taylor All-Stars Converse. Yeah. So, but if she were to show up to the AT today, and every March, April, May, many, many thousands of people show up at the southern terminus, which is Springer Mountain, to start a through hike. And if she showed up today carrying what she carried in 1955, I'm afraid a lot of people would laugh at her or try to stop her and say, you don't have enough gear, you don't have the proper gear and that sort of thing. But she made it just fine. She made do with what she had.
Yeah, and I think what we have to take a break, but I think one of the things that struck me over and over about your telling is the faith this woman had in herself. I mean, she had had such a challenging life and such a very difficult, abusive marriage, and worked so hard and raised so many children and grandchildren, so that by the time she finally got free to go do this, it was as if, I don't know, almost she'd waited her whole life to do something for herself. And I find, just as a woman who has grown children as well, that when you think about arriving, I'm 65, and so she was just a year or two older than me. And when I think about, oh yeah, I think I'm just going to say goodbye and head out on the trail and not let my family know where I am, which she didn't. Nobody knew where she was. She just disappeared one day, went walking, and it was because of all the media attention that she attracted that they finally learned where she was, how she was, etc. If you're just joining us, a superb author, fantastic book, Ben Montgomery's book, Grandma Gatewood's Walk, the inspiring story of the woman who saved the Appalachian Trail, a Chicago Review Press, 2016. Hi, I'm Zoe Hieronimus, inviting you to read my new book, White Spirit Animals, Prophets of Change. Explore the power and wisdom of sacred white spirit animals, which are held sacred by indigenous cultures and are part of shamanic traditions worldwide. The white spirit bear, lion, elephant, wolf, and buffalo are apex guardians of complex ecosystems. Learn why they must all be protected and what wisdom teachings they share. Discover how dream telepathy with nature, animals, and each other can be used for positive transformation in the world today. Read White Spirit Animals, Prophets of Change, and find more online at www.whitespiritanimals.com. That's www.whitespiritanimals.com.
Hello, my name is Vernell Mitchell Hawkins, 4-H educator for University of Maryland Extension. You can learn more about our programs in youth development at www.extension.umd.edu. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronimus.
Welcome back. Our guest is author Ben Montgomery. His fantastic book, if you're looking for a wonderful book to pick up for the summer or winter or spring or fall, Grandma Gatewood's Walk, the inspiring story of the woman who saved the Appalachian Trail, a Chicago Review Press 2016 release. So when you started this story, you obviously had an interest in following where she had gone. Were there questions you had that never got answered, Ben?
Oh, sure. I wish that I wish that I could have taken a walk with her. I wish I could have met her in person. A lot of times people ask, what would you ask her if you had one question? And I'm not sure I can arrive at one specific question, but I do think that I would like to know more about what she was feeling when she first set off on the AT, and whether she did it to spite her husband. As you mentioned before the break, they had a terrible relationship. He was abusive, oppressive, hard-fisted, and they lived in a small town where people tended to mind their own business. And so, she didn't start. She always, when she would run away from him, she'd be taking a beating at his hands, and she'd run away, and she'd find solace in the woods. She'd hide out in nature until he calmed down, and that becomes very clear in her writing. But she never says to anyone specifically why she decided to hike the Appalachian Trail. And I have my hunches, and that's sort of the question that drives part of the book. But I think I would ask her, why did you do this? Why at your age, did you set out on this, ultimately a perilous journey?
And not once. I mean, she did this, what was it, 4 times?
She did it 3 times.
3 times. It's unbelievable.
Basically taking the exact same equipment, the second and third time. She didn't upgrade much at all.
And then she went on to walk other trails. I think the Argonne Trail was one of them.
That's right. in 1959, she read a newspaper article that said there was a wagon train that had left Independence, Missouri on its way to Portland, Oregon, retracing the old Oregon Trail to celebrate the Oregon Centennial. And she decided that she had nothing better to do, so she was going to go for it. And she set off. She flew to Independence, Missouri, and set off on foot past the wagon train in about 2 weeks. And 90 days later, arrived in Portland, Oregon, to much fanfare. 5,000 people lined the streets, lined Burnside, waiting for Grandma Gatewood to come in town. She'd been made an official ambassador at large. So she was celebrated by the people of Oregon. They took her up in a helicopter. They took her out on a boat into the ocean. It landed her a small appearance on You Bet Your Life with Groucho Marx,
Right.
which is kind of funny. So she put in, starting about at the age of 67, by my calculation, she put in about 14,000 miles on foot from that age until she died at the age of 84.
And what was so interesting, the way you tell it, is she had never been sick, not a day in her life, according to her family, and that
Yeah.
when she got sick one day, said something's wrong, went to the hospital, and passed away within a couple of days. Is that how you said it?
That's right. She called her son Nelson and said, I feel ill. And it was so foreign, that experience, that he immediately called the hospital and sent an ambulance to her house. She fell into a coma and a short time later was dead. But according to the family that was with her at the time, just before she passed, she hummed a few bars of Battle Hymn of the Republic, which I think is pretty interesting.
Fascinating, fascinating. And, in one place in the book, when she talked to a newspaper reporter, which they were always following her, finding her in towns, interviewing her, she commented that, quote, "the stillness and quiet of the forests has always seemed wonderful, and I like the peacefulness," unquote. And, there's a whole movement out of Japan of forest bathing, which means to let the
Oh, yeah.
forest bathe you. And so there's sort of this reclamation of appreciating that nature heals us, and that preserving nature is not just common sense, it's an obligation. And I feel like that was part of what she brought to everybody's awareness, was the sacredness and the specialness of the wilderness. Now, you actually walked the trail as well.
Only chunks. I am engaged in a serious effort to try to stitch together a complete section hike of the trail. When I started reporting the story, I first of all didn't have the time it takes
Yeah.
to go hike the AT in full. And then I learned very, very early on that about 95% of the trail is different today than it was in 1955.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause they're constantly moving the trail to protect sensitive plants and wildlife, and also to prevent erosion and to give hikers a better experience and that sort of thing. So a big chunk of the trail is different today than it was when she walked. But I knew there were some spots that I wanted to see. I wanted to be able to recreate, see them with my own eyes. She, for instance, sits on the Maryland Bluffs, which overlook Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, and she had a special experience on the 4th of July there. She wrote a diary entry sitting up on those rocks. And so I thought, I need to go there. I need to see what she saw. And so in that way, I sort of chased her ghost up and down the trail, just dropping in on little chunks that I knew were important to her, and I wanted to try to connect with her there.
Well, and one of the things you come away with is, a lot of people, it's said that many trail walkers, hikers are introverts, and she was not. I mean, she was very generous with her heart and her time. And I love that story of that she ended up in a wretched storm, having to sleep in a hut out of the rain with a pastor who had brought
Right.
two rival gangs from New York City to try to make peace. And that then one of those boys recounted the experience of a white woman sleeping with them in the hut years later. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, that's a funny story because her family told me that story, and They told it in the way Emma recorded it in her journal, which was that she was in the Green Mountains, Vermont, and she needed, it had been raining. She was walking through the second of two hurricanes that had kind of taken the same track, and they were just dumping buckets of rain on her. And so a lot of the streams she was trying to pass were flooded, escaped their banks, and she was having a difficult time making it along the trail. When she comes upon a shelter that was occupied by 8, as she writes in her journal, 8 colored boys and 2 white leaders from a Catholic parish in Harlem. And she said the boys were very kind to her. They shared their corn pone. She thought they were a little rambunctious because they were picking unripe apples off the trees and kind of throwing them at each other. But she, wrote it off as teenagers at play. I was always curious about this because it just, a big question for me. What were these 8 youths doing on the AT in 1955? And so I spent no small amount of time trying to track down that story, and I finally did. And it was left in a self-published book written by one of those white Catholic pastors. And he said that the summer of 1955 in Harlem was very, very hot, and as a result, very bloody. The gangs were going after each other left and right, and the body count was high, and the problem became so bad that the Catholic Church decided to step in. And so one high up in the church appointed these 2 young seminarians to identify the 4 head honchos of the 2 rival gangs and take them on an all expenses paid trip to the Green Mountains, Vermont, in an effort to broker the peace. And so these were the boys that Emma spent the night with. And this is 55. This is before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, so before the Birmingham bus boycott. This is a year after Brown versus Board of Education, which of course sparked a lot of racial violence in the South and in Appalachia. And so just to imagine a genteel, farm-reared white woman from southeastern Ohio bedding down for a night with 8 gangsters from Harlem is it's a funny thing. She wrote in her journal that she had a hard time falling asleep because she curled up in a corner, and one of the boys, in his sleep, he kept throwing his arm over her, and she'd move it off, and he'd throw it back on, and she'd move it off. But she wrote to them when she finished the AT. She dropped a letter in the mail in Millinocket, Maine, or Bangor, Maine, back to that one of the white pastors. And she said, tell those boys if they're ever anywhere near southeastern Ohio to come visit me because I owe them my life. Mm-hmm. And she felt like the next day as they all walked out together, they came to a creek that they couldn't pass. And she had actually ridden on the back of one of those boys across this flood stage creek. So it's kind of a touching little story.
It's a beautiful story. I mean, you describe how she said, and here's this grandma stuck in the middle of the raging river, and it had not been for them, she would have been drowned, probably.
Right. Certainly couldn't have made it all the way across without them.
Yeah. And the thing is, as you tell her journey in so many details from so many different directions of the media and the people that she met and her journals, was her faith in people. It's very interesting for a woman who has been so awfully abused and beaten by her husband for so many decades until she finally earned a divorce, to have such trust in others, men, women, people she didn't know, complete strangers. And as she said, you learned pretty quickly by looking at the way somebody looked at her, whether they would give her a place to stay that night, in their barn, or whether somebody would invite her into their home for dinner. Talk to us about the sort of the way in which the community used to respond to strangers, which is not the same today.
Yeah, she never met a stranger. And I talked to a couple of folks who recall her just sort of showing up at their door, knocking and kind of introducing herself and helping herself to the kitchen table. By and large, many people took her in, and she couldn't have finished a through hike. She had nothing to eat with her, basically. And so she relied on the kindness of strangers over and over and over again. One of the insightful things that she pointed out in her journal was that the larger the house, the less likely they were to let her stay. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of interesting. So she's saying that, the poorer folks who lived along the AT were far more likely to open their doors and give her a place to sleep, even if that meant, inviting her to sleep in an automobile or in a barn or sometimes on a porch swing. But yeah, that trail community, and a lot of folks who lived near the AT at the time didn't necessarily know that a trail ran through their backyard.
Hmm.
So it was a new experience to see hikers kind of walking near their property, and so many of them were introduced to the trail through her, and came to learn about the trail and subsequently to support people who are taking the same walk.
And she is celebrated. I mean, there is at least one memorial to her, isn't there, on the trail that people come to every year?
That's right. There are a couple. So there's a trail named after her in Hocking Hills, Ohio, which isn't a part of the Appalachian Trail system, but it's important nonetheless. It was her favorite 6 mile stretch of trail of all the walking she did. And that's called the Grandma Gatewood Trail in Hocking Hills, Ohio. It has a very handsome plaque embedded into a big boulder right at the trailhead. And they have a winter hike on that trail every January. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 to 5,500 people show up in the freezing cold to take a hike in her honor,
How lovely.
which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then along the Appalachian Trail, there are still signs of her. There's an outfitter in Damascus, Virginia, that has a pair of her sneakers. In Boiling Springs, Pennsylvania, in the Appalachian Trail Hall of Fame and Museum, there's a very handsome display that includes some of her stuff, including, I think, the cane that she carried along the way and some of her personal items and a very nice carved bust of Emma Gatewood. So her presence is still seen on the trail, and then her legacy exists all over the place. People still tell stories about her. She's well remembered. A lot of folks, interestingly, report seeing her on the trail if they're having a difficult hike or they're trying to traverse a stretch where they're dealing with that question that seems to hit everybody engaged in a through hike. Will I make it? Can I make it? Should I turn back? Should I stop? A number of people have reported, Emma Gatewood's ghost showing up at just the right time to say, I did it. And you can too. You keep going.
How beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's not uncommon. You know, I do a lot of reporting and interviewing on the interdimensional realities of our lives, and that the soul, when it leaves its body, is not gone and disappeared. It's still present. And oftentimes, great teachers, leaders, others who have succeeded at something will spend much of their life after life helping those doing similar things. And so it's nice to hear that people actually feel that. Did you feel her presence in your own journey?
I did, and I'm not sure. It's a stretch to say that I felt a spirit or a ghost, but I had spent so much time reading her words, trying to get into her head. We took a hike, the northernmost stretch leading up to Mount Katahdin, which is the northern terminus, and we followed in her footsteps. One of the few stretches of the trail that's exactly the same today as it was in 1955. And so on that climb, I got to say, I felt as close to her as I've ever felt. I got back home from that trip and started writing the books a short time later, and it was going great. The words were flowing. I felt creative and artistic, and then I hit a spot in the outline where I knew that it was time to write her toward her death, and I went through a strange process that I've never experienced as a writer before or since. And I would go out to my office. It was time to work, and I would sit down, and I would just cry. And I thought I was going crazy. I thought maybe the pressure of the deadline was getting to me or something like that. And I told my wife, I am really struggling with this. For 3 days in a row, I've gone and sat down in the office ready to write, and I can't do anything. I just cry. Mm-hmm. And she said, you don't want her to die. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's exactly right. Like I had gotten so into her head. I had come to love her, this woman that, I never knew. I had come to love her in a way that was really, she was special to me. And I, in a way, was mourning her passing.
That makes sense.
even though
I don't find that
that's
odd, by the way. I
yeah,
think that it's
yeah.
a beautiful testimony to the
Oh,
fact
thank you.
that you did connect to the soul of this person and she to you. And she says you're like a son.
Oh, that's
So
very nice to hear.
yeah, we'll be right back. Ben Montgomery's our guest. Grandma Gatewood's Walk, the inspiring story of the woman who saved the Appalachian Trail. Chicago Review Press 2016 release.
Hi, this is Dr. Susan Arick, founder of the Earthfire Institute Wildlife Sanctuary and Retreat Center, just west of Van Teton National Park. Our mission is to expand a sense of community to truly include all life in our thinking, and what a difference that would make in our decision-making and in the state of the earth. You can learn more about us at www.earthfireinstitute.org. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronimus.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Don't forget, all of our guests and our shows are archived online for free at 21stcenturyradio.com, as well as they're posted weekly for free on iTunes and on the YouTube channel of ours. Ben's book, Grandma Gatewood's Walk, the inspiring story of the woman who saved the Appalachian Trail, a Chicago Review Press 2016 release. You can learn more about Ben and his other books at www.gangrey.com. So tell us a bit about your Southern Writers Collective, whose name I totally messed up.
Sure. It's the Auburn Chautauqua. We're celebrating 10 years this year. It is a group of some of the very best magazine, newspaper, book writers, songwriters in the South. And essentially we get together every October and try to make each other better.
That is fascinating. And so for 10 years, when you all meet, you discuss your work, you start works, you have basically an exchange as talent.
Everyone submits a piece of writing they've done in the past calendar year in advance, and we all spend time reading each other's work and offering our very best criticism. So when we get together, we throw some elbows and ask a bunch of interesting questions and learn from each other.
How interesting. Now, I did read that you are on to a new book, and it will be coming out, and I can't wait to read it and for you to join us, called The Man Who Walked Backward.
It's actually out. It's in bookstores now. It tells a story of a man named Plenty Wingo who in 1931 lost his cafe in Abilene, Texas to the bank. This is the front end of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. And he decided he needed to do something big and amazing to get rich and famous. And he decided he would try to walk backward around the world.
Now, did you actually travel around the world following his trail, too? I get your theme. Where do I want to go?
I sure did. I followed in his footsteps all the way from Fort Worth, Texas to Boston, where he boarded a boat and landed at Hamburg, Germany. And I followed him from Hamburg, Germany, all the way to Istanbul, where he ran into some difficulties, wound up in jail, and was forced to abandon his attempt. And made to return to the United States. So I love these travelogues. It gives me a chance not only to see the world for myself, but also to learn about people in different times, people who did interesting things, went on quests. There's something really appealing about that to me. So I remain proud of this book. It tells the story of a really quirky fellow who had some sky-high ambitions and went about it at a fascinating time in American history.
Well, good. I'm going to have to read it. You'll have to rejoin us so we can tell another adventure tale. So when you look at all, because people always ask me, I've written 4 books. One was in Kabbalah, one was on the future of consciousness, and one was on the white spirit animals. And people always ask me, how do you think these things up? And I tell them the truth. I actually don't. I wait for spirit or a waking vision to guide me, and then I pursue it with gusto, and that's all I do for 4 to 6 years, basically, doing the research and writing. So when you look around, talk to us about this process of being a staff writer and what it's like to come up with stories and how you select and the freedom you have. And obviously, you're highly respected, so you probably have more freedom than many writers who work on staff anywhere.
Yeah, my newspaper work is a little different from my book work in that I lost interest in just telling stories for the sake of telling stories quite a while back. With my newspaper work, are you maybe familiar with the Hebrew phrase tikkun olam,
Sure.
which is, yeah,
Sure. Healing the world,
that's right.
restoring the world. Uh-huh.
My mentor, God rest his soul, Mike Levine, who was editor at the Times Herald Record in Middletown, New York, he used to suggest that's the role of a community journalist to heal the world, and that we have an opportunity to do that with every story. And so most of my newspaper work has been dedicated to telling stories that exact some kind of justice or help rectify a past mistake. They tend to be, along the lines of investigative reporting and on social justice issues. So, that's what gets me going. That's what fuels my that side of my work. And then the book work, I feel, is more selfish. I get to tell these really incredible stories about people who set off to do interesting things. So there's a little bit of difference to that work. But I love what you said about the spirit speaking to you and sort of the idea showing itself to you, because I felt that with every book that I've done so far. It's, kind of lands in my lap, and I have somebody like Grandma Gatewood knocking on the door saying, "It's time you told my story."
Exactly. No, and I, if you're not a writer and you don't write books, it seems a little peculiar to some people. And I said, but I'm not thinking these things up. I don't sit around and go, "Oh, I think I'll do this." I mean, I do think about a few things, and I
Right.
reject them all until something happens, and then it's so clear and so compelling, and often the impression to do it happens within the short space of a minute, where I'm shown a whole picture, because I tend to write esoterica, and so I'm shown, maps of heaven and maps of the spirit worlds and maps of the earth world, and then I have to figure out what I was just shown. So I spend the
Right.
4 years sort of reverse engineering the image that I'm shown. One was on the tabernacle tradition of how did they bring down, the spirit of God, and anyway,
Oh, wow.
and so like you, I go on the trail. I wrote on prophets, and I had to go on the trail of the prophets, and I'm not a Bible scholar. I knew nothing basically, and had to
Wow.
learn it, which was really quite a journey. But it's so moving forward, are there things you have on tap that you're going, well, I can't wait to travel on this one? I have a good one
Yeah.
for you. Maybe
Yeah.
the spirit of seeds will come to you. Seed banking. There are some remarkable people on the planet right now trying to save the seed bank from
Ah,
what's
interesting.
happening. Yeah, there's a wonderful woman in India. I mean, real pioneers who are, I would like to find those in America who are doing that, because there were seed banking for a while and libraries held them, and then states started making it illegal. And
Mm.
then, then the GMOs came in and felt threatened by the independence and autonomy. And it's such an essential story that I hope somebody tells, because there are great people like ancient pioneers who preserved seed and passed it down. And that's how we still have heirloom seeds today.
That sounds like you've already started work on this.
Oh no, I'm not doing that book. That's you can pass that down to one of your writers in your collective. I like to
I
pass
like
on
that.
ideas. What haven't we touched on, Ben, that you'd like to share about your journey?
Well, interestingly, what you just said about being shown maps or signs, the very first thing I got when I started reporting on Plenty Wingo and his backward walk was a 1931 road atlas, and it was one of the first ever uh, road atlases for the United States. And if you think about it, before 31, there weren't enough automobiles on the roads to create a market for atlases. But this was actually a touring atlas, and it's a beautiful thing. I paid way too much money for it. Bought it from an antiquarian bookstore. But it was my first step in reporting. I needed to see where this guy would have walked in 1931 and how that was going to be different. And I don't know, it got me thinking about about how roads are made, and typically start as game trails and then turn into footpaths and then turn into sometimes into county roads or dirt roads, and then eventually they're paved, and then eventually they're widened, and pretty soon you have interstate highways crisscrossing the country. I don't know, there's something neat about that to me.
Mm-hmm. No, and all of these things. I was an investigative reporter for decades and did a lot of whistleblowing, and people would ask how you get your information. I said, you follow the trail.
Yeah,
And I always
that's right.
felt like that I was sort of a trail hunter, even though I'm not a big trail walker and I don't really plan on doing it. But I do like walking in the woods tremendously.
Oh,
So I wish you and your children a wonderful 161 miles you're doing. Is that it? In Virginia?
that's right.
Wow.
That's right. We did 250 last summer from further south portion of the trail from Hot Springs, North Carolina to Springer Mountain, Georgia. So we're going the other direction this year in a different stretch, and we're really looking forward to it. We'll leave here in 2 weeks.
Oh, have a wonderful, wonderful, safe journey. Did you
Thank you.
always know you wanted to be a writer?
No, I didn't. I wanted to be a farmer when I was growing up. I always imagined going off to college and studying agriculture and coming back to a little place called Slick, Oklahoma, where my grandfather had a 300-acre cattle farm. And but I found writing in college kind of by chance, and realized that this was what I was meant to do. And I still want to be a farmer, but the writing is fuels my spirit now.
Yeah, it's
Pays
beautiful.
the bills too.
Well, now I understand why I told you about the seeds.
Yeah.
There you are. Put those seeds
There it
back in
is.
the dirt where they belong with independent
Right.
growers and states. I hope at some point every state in our country has a seed bank, because I think it's really prudent for the future we all face together. Ben Montgomery, it is such a pleasure to know you, such a pleasure to interview you, and
Thank you so much.
wonderful, wonderful book. And I'm looking forward to also reading The Man Who Walked Backward, Grandma Gatewood's Walk, the inspiring story of the woman who saved the Appalachian Trail, Chicago Review Press 2016, and Ben is at Gangrey, GANGREY.com.
Stay connected and stay informed on the #1 news talk station, Talk Radio 680, WCBM, Baltimore, and WCBM.com.